normal people. And what I talked about with my therapist the other day was I'm having a hard time opening up because...
For a long time, the murmurs never stopped. For a long time, the speculation lingered. And for a long time, no one said a word. Until now. Because Tasha K has broken her silence, and the claims she's putting forward are rattling the reality TV universe. Just days after Porsha Williams spoke openly about her sexuality, the internet rushed to label it healing, evolution, personal truth. But according to allegations now gaining traction, that version of events may only scratch the surface. Insiders suggest Porsha's so-called revelation isn't a beginning at all, but a carefully timed glimpse into a life that's been hidden in plain sight. Not only rumored relationships with men, but alleged entanglements with women too. Clips resurface. Old scenes hit differently. Archived party footage starts to look less accidental. What once sounded like baseless gossip is now being stitched together into something far more unsettling. And that's when the narrative shifts. Because Tasha K isn't stopping at accusations of cheating, she's pointing toward what she claims is a serious health-related issue that may have been deliberately shielded from public view. Claims wrapped in silence. Claims tied to potential danger. Claims suggesting that people close to Porsha were quietly alarmed long before fans ever caught on. Now the internet is divided straight down the middle. Some dismiss it as attention-seeking noise. Others argue, when the same whispers start coming from too many directions, coincidence stops making sense. Because this conversation has moved beyond identity. Now it's about honesty. It's about broken trust. And it's about what happens when alleged truths refuse.
Yeah, because she started talking about, because of my marriage, I think I'm gay. I'd consider being gay. You don't consider being gay, but go ahead, Porsha.
Lonely. I can't connect with other men. It's like people trying to introduce me, but it's just when it's not the same, it's not the same. So I'm going to do it different this time. I'm going to be alone until I'm whole. And then when I'm whole, then I will, open myself back up so I don't make the same mistake again.
How wide we talking?
When you go through a bad enough breakup, you're like, I don't like nobody. Like, you're like, I don't like nobody. I was sitting there, I was like, do I like women enough? Can I get with a woman? Like, who can come in and fill this void? Like, oh my God, somebody. I have got to be able to sit with someone and feel a part of what I felt with him. But I don't yet.
For years, Porsha Williams carefully crafted a story of survival. A woman shaped by heartbreak. A woman who emerged from broken marriages sharper, tougher, untouched by defeat. A woman who, regardless of scandal, always managed to land upright. Now that story is being closely examined, because while Porsha's recent comments about her sexuality were initially embraced online as honesty and healing, fresh allegations are pushing audiences to confront a far more uncomfortable question. Was this truly a moment of self-realization, or a strategic move to get ahead of something bigger? Sources close to the situation claim Porsha didn't speak out on impulse. They say the timing followed years of rumors that simply refused to disappear. Rumors about what allegedly happened behind closed doors. Rumors about relationships that never made it into edited episodes. And rumors about a private reality that clashed sharply with the image viewers were sold, and that's exactly where Tasha K steps into the frame. Tasha K isn't calling this a moment of courage. She's calling it a confession that arrived late. According to her allegations, what Porsha now labels as healing is something people in her inner circle reportedly noticed long ago. Not as transformation, but as repetition. A repetition marked by emotional withdrawal and relationships. A repetition marked by sudden, unexplained breakups, and a repetition that, according to multiple claims, included alleged relationships with women long before the public was ever looped into the narrative. What makes this moment so explosive isn't just what's being alleged, it's when it's happening, because only days after the internet celebrated Porsha for embracing her truth, critics began noticing something that didn't sit right. Her words didn't sound like a beginning, they sounded like a defense.
And I think that now that I'm realizing that, because what I've decided is that I'm not going to look for it anymore. So I'm not going to push myself into dating or anyone or trying to figure out, who do I like? Who could I be around? Because this is probably also part of healing.
Healing.
I mean, just sitting with this.
What's the healing?
Sitting with being alone, sitting with the loss, and let myself heal the loss. And I know I'm crying right now, but I feel good every day, each day. I get better each day. I feel stronger. But I ain't gonna lie, it's hard. It's hard living lonely when you know you have to live lonely for a while.
Yeah.
She says she's done looking for connection. She says solitude is now a choice, not a failure. She speaks about healing, grief, and being emotionally drained. She admits it isn't easy. She admits there are tears. She admits loneliness has quietly become part of her routine. On the surface, it sounds raw, but critics argue this wasn't about recovery. It was about control, because instead of confronting specific rumors or past actions, the focus shifted to feeling pain, fragility, isolation, and that pivot matters. In media playbooks, emotion often replaces answers when answers carry risk. According to analysts, this follows a familiar formula. You don't refute, you don't validate, you soften the image, and for a moment, it worked. Clips from that interview flooded social platforms. Fans labeled her courageous. Supporters applauded her for choosing peace. But not everyone was persuaded, because some viewers were paying attention to a parallel story unfolding quietly behind the scenes. Old screenshots resurfaced. Archived reality TV moments were replayed. Party footage from years back suddenly carried a different weight when viewed through a new lens. Moments once brushed off as humor, interactions once dismissed as harmless, now appeared, to some, as fragments of a much larger picture. According to individuals familiar with production circles, there were ongoing discussions about Porsha's conduct that never reached the screen. Discussions about boundaries. Discussions about blurred dynamics. Discussions about cast members who allegedly felt uneasy but chose silence to avoid backlash. Those stories were never verified. They were never disputed. They simply lingered. Until now, and this is where the tone turns heavier. Because Tasha K isn't just alleging cheating, she's alleging exposure. According to her claims, people closest to Porsha weren't only worried about infidelity. They were allegedly concerned about health-related risks that were never publicly addressed. These accusations carry weight, and they're being delivered cautiously. No paperwork has surfaced. No medical proof has been released. But the accusation alone has shifted the entire conversation. This is no longer about self-expression. This is about accountability. Sources claim questions were raised privately about whether everyone involved was fully informed about potential risks. Those questions were allegedly dismissed, downplayed, or ignored, and this is where the discussion becomes unsettling, because if even a portion of these claims holds truth, then the debate isn't about orientation, it's about trust. Critics of Tasha K call her irresponsible. They accuse her of chasing relevance. They say she's exploiting a sensitive subject, but her defenders see it differently. They argue that when similar claims emerge from multiple angles, former partners, insiders, and now media figures, it no longer feels random, and that's why the internet has splintered. One side insists this is a calculated attack. A personal vendetta wrapped in controversy. The other side believes silence has shielded too much for too long, because here's the detail that refuses to disappear. None of this surfaced overnight. These weren't new allegations. They were old conversations given fresh attention. And when Porsha chose to speak now, framing everything as healing, critics argue she underestimated how closely the public was watching. Because in an era of saved clips and permanent digital records, narratives don't vanish. They wait. Legal analysts are already whispering about possible consequences, not because anything has been proven, but because of what's being suggested. Cease and desist notices, quiet resolutions, preemptive messaging. These are often the next moves when stories reach this level of scrutiny, and yet, so far, there's been no official response. No lawsuit. No firm denial. No clarification. Only quiet and silence in moments like this speaks loudly, because while statements remain absent, something else keeps intensifying. Anxiety. Anxiety that more footage could emerge. Anxiety that private conversations might surface. Anxiety that those who stayed quiet may decide they're done carrying someone else's secrets. This isn't about truth versus lies. It's about positioning. Porsha positioned herself as healing. Tasha K positioned herself as revealing. And the audience is left suspended between both, trying to decide which version feels closer to reality. Because the most troubling question still lingers. If all of this is untrue, why hasn't it been stopped? And if any of it is accurate, how long before the next release pushes this story into territory no one can rein in? Because what began as a discussion about identity has become something else entirely. It's a measure of credibility. A measure of responsibility, and a measure of how many secrets can remain hidden once silence finally collapses, and this story is only beginning. By the time the conversation reached this point, the story had already moved beyond healing. It had moved into contradiction. Because while Porsha Williams positioned her recent comments as personal growth, critics began revisiting something far more uncomfortable: her past. Not old tweets, Not out-of-context jokes, but public statements made on record. And that's where the narrative began to fracture. According to those analyzing the situation, the issue isn't that Porsha spoke about her sexuality. The issue is how sharply that conversation conflicts with her previous public stance. And this is where Tasha K shifts from observer to accuser.
The gay part really kind of made me go, not Porsha. Really, we're gonna go there. We're gonna go that you've been abused by so many men, even though you went looking for this lady's husband. Got him, didn't even tell him why you wanted a divorce. Didn't even tell him you wanted a divorce, just divorced him. Didn't answer no question. It's like, oh, you're hurt, you're going through so much. And now you're like, will a woman be with me? Wasn't there talks, I think, between her and Drew of Porsha allegedly like sleeping with women? Or was it Candy? It was one of them episodes, Candy. They always said Porsha ain't coochie. But listen, here's the thing.
In this segment, the tone hardens. The host openly questions why Porsha would suddenly introduce sexuality into the conversation now, especially after years of sidestepping similar rumors. The framing is clear. Really? We're going there. The implication isn't curiosity. It's skepticism. According to the commentary, this moment feels less like honesty and more like repositioning, an attempt to reframe long-standing rumors as self-discovery rather than accountability. This is where the word performative enters the discourse. Critics argue that emotional framing can be used to neutralize scrutiny. That when a narrative becomes about pain and healing, it becomes harder to ask direct questions without appearing insensitive. And yet, the questions didn't stop, because many remembered something else. Something older. Something documented.
But it just put me in the mind frame of like, wasn't she preaching back in the day against LGBTQism? Didn't she preach and say it was against God the whole time? And now you considering whether or not you should be with a woman? These women better hide their purses out here for real.
Archived footage is referenced from a time before reality television fame, showing Porsha delivering a religious message. A message that framed LGBTQ identity as something to be corrected, prayed for, or saved. The contrast is stark. On one side, a woman now discussing fluidity, loneliness, and openness. On the other, a woman who once publicly condemned the same identities she is now said to be exploring. According to critics, this isn't growth, it's contradiction without explanation. And the audience noticed. Clips from that sermon began circulating online within hours. Side-by-side comparisons flooded timelines. Comment sections filled with the same question. Which version is real? Supporters argue people evolve. That belief systems change. That growth isn't linear. But skeptics argue something else entirely. They argue that growth requires acknowledgement and accountability requires clarity. And neither, they say, has been offered. Instead, what followed was silence. No clarification. No apology. No context. Just the sudden appearance of a new narrative, one that conveniently reframed years of rumors as personal awakening. And that's why this part of the story refuses to die. Because according to sources familiar with the situation, the whispers about Porsha's alleged relationships with women didn't originate from fans. They allegedly originated from people within the same circles she moved in. Industry insiders, production staff, other cast members. Again, none of this has been proven. But the consistency of the claims has raised eyebrows. And consistency is dangerous. Because when different people, from different places, begin telling variations of the same story, it becomes harder to dismiss everything as coincidence. That's when narratives collapse. This is also where the health allegations resurface, not as a standalone accusation, but as part of a broader pattern of secrecy. According to claims circulating online, individuals close to Porsha allegedly expressed concern about transparency in her relationships. Not just emotional transparency, but physical responsibility. These claims remain unverified. No documentation has been released. No official statements have been made. But the suggestion alone has shifted the tone of public discourse from gossip to gravity. This isn't just about who someone loves. It's about what they disclose and what they don't. Legal analysts note that when allegations move into health-related territory, the stakes change dramatically. What was once rumor becomes risk. What was once entertainment becomes liability. And that's why many believe this is the calm before something much louder. Because silence at this stage is strategic. If legal action were imminent, statements would be measured. If evidence were weak, denials would be swift. If everything were false, corrections would be aggressive. Instead, there's nothing, which has only fueled speculation. Online, the debate has hardened into two camps. One side argues that Tasha K is exploiting controversy, repackaging old rumors to stay relevant. They point to her history of provocative claims and legal battles as proof that this is performance, not truth. The other side argues that this moment feels different. Because unlike past controversies, this one didn't start with a leak. It started with Porsha herself opening the door. And once that door opened, people walked through with receipts. Old footage, archived interviews, reality show scenes that suddenly carried new meaning. Moments where boundaries blurred. Interactions that now read differently. According to observers, this is the danger of partial disclosure. When you tell part of the story, you invite others to tell the rest. And the rest, they say, is what's coming next. Privately, industry insiders are said to be preparing for fallout. Not public fallout, legal fallout. Because when narratives spiral this fast, someone usually tries to regain control. Cease and desist letters are often the first step. Quiet warnings. Private calls. And yet, none have surfaced. Which raises another question. Is there hesitation because someone isn't sure what else might surface? Because the fear now isn't just allegations, it's evidence. Videos that haven't leaked. Messages that haven't been posted. People who haven't spoken yet. It's about pressure. Pressure building quietly behind closed doors. Pressure on reputations. Pressure on alliances. Because once a narrative collapses publicly, it doesn't rebuild easily. And right now, the cracks are visible. The past doesn't match the present. The sermons don't match the statements. The silence doesn't match the noise. And until those contradictions are addressed head-on, this story will continue to grow, not because of rumor, but because of unanswered questions. The most unsettling part isn't what's been said. It's what hasn't. Because in scandals like this, the truth rarely arrives all at once. It leaks. And when it does, it never asks permission. Music fades low. Because if this really were just growth, it wouldn't look this defensive. And if it were just rumor, it wouldn't be this loud. Some stories don't disappear. They wait. By now, the conversation had moved far beyond speculation. What began as whispers turned into patterns. What started as curiosity hardened into doubt. And what was once dismissed as rumor began to feel organized. Because after the interviews, after the resurfaced footage, and after the contradictions were laid bare, something unmistakable happened. The noise didn't die down. It intensified. Observers began noting a familiar shift, one that often appears when public narratives reach a breaking point. The tone changed. Not louder, not messier, but quieter, more controlled, more deliberate. And silence followed. No emergency statements. No extended clarifications. No direct responses to the mounting claims. Just carefully chosen appearances, carefully worded posts, and a noticeable avoidance of specifics. According to media analysts, this kind of silence is rarely accidental. It's strategic. Because when allegations grow too complex to deny outright, the safest move is often to say nothing at all and wait for attention to drift elsewhere. But in this case, attention refused to move on. Instead, people began connecting dots. They revisited timelines. They rewatched old episodes. They compared language, then versus now. And what many noticed was a recurring pattern of selective disclosure. Moments when questions were answered vaguely. Moments when emotional framing replaced factual clarity. Moments when accountability was sidestepped in favor of sympathy. According to critics, this wasn't accidental vulnerability. It was narrative management. And that perception changed everything. Because once an audience believes they're being managed, trust erodes fast. And trust, once broken, doesn't return quietly. At the center of this storm remain two opposing forces. On one side, Porsha Williams, a reality TV figure whose brand has long been built on openness, relatability, and emotional access. On the other, Tasha K, a controversial commentator who thrives in the uncomfortable space between allegation and exposure. But this story is no longer about either woman individually. It's about what happens when public personas collide with unresolved histories. Because according to sources close to the entertainment industry, the real concern isn't what has already been said, it's what hasn't. There is growing speculation that conversations are happening behind closed doors. Conversations involving lawyers, publicists, network executives. Not about guilt, not about innocence, but about containment. How far will this story go? How many people are involved? And how much can safely remain buried? Industry insiders point out that when legal teams become active, the goal isn't always to fight, it's to freeze. Freeze discussion. Freeze leaks. Freeze momentum. And yet, momentum continues to build. Because the internet doesn't operate on silence. It operates on curiosity. Every unanswered question becomes a theory. Every missing detail becomes a clue. And in this case, the absence of firm denial has been louder than any statement could be. Especially as more individuals begin hinting quietly that they were aware of things long before the public was. Nothing explicit. Nothing actionable. Just enough suggestion to keep the fire alive. According to analysts, this is the most dangerous phase of any controversy. Not the accusation, not the evidence, but the implication. Because implication invites imagination. And imagination fills gaps faster than facts ever could. And that's why this moment feels different. Not chaotic, not explosive, but tense. Like something waiting to break. There's also the matter of legacy. For years, Porsha's image has been carefully cultivated, not just as a reality star, but as a figure of empowerment. Someone who speaks up, someone who survives, someone who grows. But growth, critics argue, requires confrontation, not avoidance. And that's where this story refuses to resolve. Because while the narrative has shifted toward healing and self-acceptance, the past has not been addressed directly. The sermons weren't explained. The contradictions weren't acknowledged. The rumors weren't confronted head-on. Instead, the audience was asked to move forward without answers. And audiences rarely comply, especially when the stakes feel personal. Because for some viewers, this isn't about celebrity gossip. It's about honesty, about accountability, about whether public figures owe clarity when their actions potentially affect others. And that's where the health allegations, still unverified, linger ominously in the background. Not as proof, not as fact, but as possibility. A possibility serious enough that legal experts say it changes how everything else is interpreted. Because once allegations touch on responsibility and risk, silence stops looking neutral. It starts looking calculated. And calculated silence invites scrutiny. As the days pass, the pressure mounts. Fans demand explanations. Critics demand accountability. Supporters demand fairness. And still, no direct response. Which leaves the story suspended in an uncomfortable space. Not resolved. Not dismissed. Just waiting. Waiting for someone to blink. Waiting for someone to speak. Waiting for the next leak, the next clip, the next voice that decides silence is no longer worth protecting. Because if history has taught the internet anything, it's this. Stories like this don't disappear. They evolve. They resurface in unexpected ways. At unexpected times. Often when those involved least expect it. It freezes it mid-breath, leaving behind one question that continues to echo louder than any allegation. If everything here is false, why hasn't it been shut down? And if even part of it is true, how long can it stay contained? Because when narratives crack, they don't heal quietly. They fracture. And when they fracture, the damage isn't always immediate. Sometimes it waits. Music fades into a low, ominous hum. What makes stories like this dangerous isn't the allegations themselves. It's the silence that follows. Because silence isn't neutral. It isn't accidental. And it isn't empty. Silence is a choice. And when that choice is made while questions remain unanswered, contradictions remain unresolved, and patterns remain unexplained, people start looking for answers elsewhere. That's where the internet steps in. Not as a court, not as a judge, but as a memory. A place where old footage doesn't disappear, where past statements don't expire, and where narratives don't reset just because someone wants them to. This story was never just about sexuality. It was never just about rumors. And it was never just about one interview. It's about trust. It's about transparency. And it's about what happens when public figures ask for understanding without offering clarity. Right now, there are two competing realities. One says this is all noise, bitterness, clout chasing, exaggeration. The other says noise doesn't get this loud without friction underneath it. And the truth? It rarely announces itself all at once. It leaks. It surfaces. It waits for the right moment. So the question isn't whether you believe everything you've heard. The question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. If none of this matters, why does it keep coming back? And if even part of it does matter, who benefits most from the silence? We'll continue watching. We'll continue tracking what's said and what isn't. And when the next piece surfaces, we'll break it down exactly the same way. No hype, no emotion bait, just the facts and the questions they raise. If you think this story ends here, history suggests otherwise. Because some truths don't disappear. They wait. Subscribe. Stay alert. And don't look